Today's speaker is Moss Rudley from the National Park Service, the Historic Preservation Training Center. Moss has certainly experienced rural living in log structures up close and personal. He was born in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, and was raised on a working cattle farm that contained numerous historic vernacular structures. His main exposure in the preservation field was in the care of hand-hewn log structures, Scotch-Irish and German notching and construction techniques. He attended Shepherd College in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and received degrees in business administration, civil engineering, and culinary arts. Looks like he covered all bases. Having lived in numerous historical homes through his home upbringing in college, he entered a career in historic preservation. And since May of 2016, he has been the acting superintendent of the training center. Moss resides in Hitchersville, West Virginia, with his wife and 2 young daughters, and he continues to support historic preservation through outreach with community preservation organizations like ours, local universities, and training sessions. Please welcome Moss Rudley.
Thank you, Ed. I really appreciate it. Now I can save some time and get into some more stuff. I don't have to introduce myself. So that's really good. No, I appreciate Preservation and Historic Winchester bringing me here today, and certainly to talk about something that I find a lot of passion in, both historic preservation and log structures. So, as Ed mentioned, I do work for the National Park Service and an organization called the Historic Preservation Training Center, and we're based out of Frederick, Maryland on the Monocacy battlefield, and our mission is really about providing preservation and maintenance through hands-on learning experiences in executing preservation projects throughout the National Park Service and with other partners in that. And in total, we have about 65 employees that go out across the country doing preservation-related projects, covering everything from masonry to windows to log cabins and alike. So it's certainly been a fulfilling career for myself, and have really enjoyed getting out and seeing the uniqueness of this country. So we're here today to talk about log cabins, and having grown up in a log cabin, my father spent a good bit of my youth running around southern West Virginia, collecting up log cabins and log structures that people were looking to demolish. And so I had my introduction early into it, and learned a lot about the construction techniques and how they were put together and utilized, and the various aspects of that. But then, as I entered the National Park Service and learned more about the Secretary of Interior standards and the various aspects that go into the laws and policy that guide some of the restoration and preservation, it took it a little bit further and was able to expand into that. So, a little bit. So, just to kind of give a brief kind of understanding of log construction in this country and how it's evolved over time. When the very earlier settlers came, the pioneers, the explorers came to this country, they had to quickly be able to build structures, build ways to keep roofs over the house, keep the Indians out, and various other aspects of it. So this country was rich in natural resources. These people came from Europe, where a lot of the resources, timber especially, was starting to be depleted. However, they had very good skills with axes and all the common tools used to do timber or log construction. So with the plentiful resources, the kind of resurgence of log construction happened about that time, where in Europe it was transforming over to being more timber framing in the 1600s and 1700s, where you utilized a lot less material but were able to build just as big structures, whereas a log structure takes a lot of material, a lot of extra time, while it does provide a lot more substance, it certainly took. So when those settlers started coming to this country, those resources were available, and log construction again kind of went on the rise. So that's where I get into this first piece of it: aesthetics versus function. Log cabins have always, the log construction is a framing style, whether it be 2x4s the way they frame houses today, or timber framing. It's just another way to put up 4 walls, construct it, and hold up a roof. So as things went from building very early settler cabins to then starting to develop communities, building more of a permanent footprint on the landscape, they started really utilizing log cabins as framing styles. And if you go through historic Winchester and any of the towns around here, you'll very much find that a lot of the early structures in the heart of downtown, some of them even brick, especially the homes, much less the businesses, but the homes have log framing styles within them. That from the exterior, the house will simply look like a normal house, but very commonly you will find log construction in there. So aesthetics being the aspect that there was always a aspect of living in a log home that kind of created a stigma that you were poor and you couldn't afford to add that second layer of siding or clapboarding to your home. So the stigma of living in a log cabin meant you were poor, you couldn't afford these things, you didn't have that. So going through time and as things transformed, people started removing the clapboards, or you get into the period of the teens and 20s, and the CCC came, and the rustic architecture started to develop, the round log construction started to happen more. Those areas really raised the status of living in a log cabin to something that was kind of more socially acceptable. Moving on through the early 1900s and into the mid-60s and 70s and the modern preservation movement and the desire to quote-unquote restore homes back to periods of time or to that original log appearance. And it kind of just shows the pendulum swing from the early time when people really didn't want that log structure to be seen to the public. It was a stigma. So, and then as I've traveled around the country, you see how culturally and regionally log structures were integrated into the vernacular architecture of the area. And certainly in this area, in the Shenandoah Valley, log structures were very common. They were very commonly used in agriculture settings for granaries, and sometimes in barns, but in a lot of the slave cabins and various aspects, log structures were done. So log structures have really kind of taken a pendulum swing, and as I said, they continue to evolve, and you see some very grand log structures nowadays. So some of the really unique characteristics to log structures and things that are key to be looking at, whether you're restoring or owning a home or thinking about it, is the notching. Those are the corner details. That is where the crux of a cabin is. When dealing with a historic structure, you can tell a lot of things by the notching style. One, you can tell the level of craftsmanship that was put into it. You can tell typically what part of Europe that notch descended out of, because culturally the Scotch and Irish came with a different notching technique than the Germans and other areas more to the east part of Europe. So, and then typically as immigrants move through the country, you will see some are earlier and some are later in that settlement period. So historically around this area you have very German-esque, or the V-notch or steeple notch as it's called sometimes. And that notch was certainly from dendrochronology and historic studies was a little earlier than the more Scotch-Irish influence of dovetails and half dovetail notching. And then I'll show you, I got a whole lots of pictures to show you kind of towards the end of this, and we'll bring a lot of this stuff back up. So by knowing the notching techniques and the way a building is notched, you can certainly get an aspect of its age, the craftsmanship, because just like today, you have people that are in the construction trade, the builders. So very often you would see in an area log structures that had those same similar characteristics from building to building, and they were hiring, especially in your higher end, your houses, your residential areas, they were being done by people who were in a building trade, and it was a trade. So getting into some of the hewing. Hewing is the process by which it takes, and this is either timber framing or log construction, but removing part of the log down to whether it be a four-sided timber or a two-sided log to the wall or thickness that you're looking to get. And that's basically the process of working through the timber. And those things were achieved simply by an axe, a felling axe, and the broad axe. These tools have not changed. They still are used today in working, doing repair work and doing modern and new construction of log cabins. It's a process that's certainly very labor intensive, but if you think about an average log cabin to comprise a two-story log cabin, you need 60 logs. That'll get you a decent two-story with about 7.5-foot ceilings in there. If you get bigger, you're up a little bit higher in log numbers. So you gotta one, fell all those logs. You gotta drag them all there. Then you have to set them up to hew them. And a good hewer, from kind of accounts, could do about 50 feet in a day. So if your cabin's 20 by 20, they're gonna get one log done, 2 logs done a day. Out of that 60, so it's quite a process just to prep all the materials to get there. I've been doing it quite a long time, so I could tell you whether the guy was right-handed or left-handed, and the process. And as you guys have looked at log cabins, you'll see the marks. There's various aspects. The marks that you see kind of perpendicular to the log, those are made with a felling axe, and those are called juggles. And it was a process you remove a big section of it, and then you work yourself down. And this is actually more like a plane than an axe. So it's not used for chopping down trees. It's only got a single bevel here, and it's actually used for shaving or planing the wood. Things that weren't typically used, but sometimes were adzes, and these were used as well in the hewing process to create even more refined level of a finish. So if you think about it in an idea of a board, you can certainly take a board that's rough sawn and plane it and make it smooth, but then you can also sand it and make it even more smooth. So it's like those 3 different tools kind of work together to gather that. Next is the chinking and daubing, and there's certainly some aspects of this that I think are misguided out there. They're 2 independent things, however they work together. Chinking is, you have spaces between logs, and depending on the craftsmanship, those gaps can vary from 1 inch, almost nothing, to 3, 4, 5, 6 inches, depending on the size of the logs and how that works. Well, that gap has to be filled by something. Corners of a log cabin carry the weight, carry the structure, but a log over a span will settle over time, and there has to be something in there. So historically, during the hewing process, they would save all their juggles, which are these big chunks. They would then split those up and put them in as chinks or chinking. You see them on a diagonal slant wedged in between logs. Those chinks then served as a substrate to apply daubing or a mortar or clay type substance that would then be put in to fill those gaps from the weather. On top of the daubing is where you would typically see any lime wash or what is commonly referred as a whitewash. Any exposed cabin, the daubing is very susceptible to weather because it was typically a clay mixture. And if any of you have ever gone in and done any work on cabins, it kind of crumbles into dust. The idea was that usually on an annual basis prior to winter, you would go around and patch that up and put a new whitewash coat on and try your best to keep the air out. And I'll get into a little later into how that plays on a restoration basis or issues. So, and then finally you have your roofs, the things that really keep the weather off the building and off the structure. Some really common issues that you end up dealing with if you own a log structure, whether it be even if it's even behind siding and you're not aware, is wood decay. That's your biggest element. And by the pendulum swing, we now have a lot of log structures that are exposed to the elements. They don't have the clapboard siding on them anymore. People very much like that aspect of having the log showing to the exterior. So certainly on the northern sides of the north-facing elevations, on other elevations, you can deal with wood decay that may or may not have occurred if the building was sided. So if things like fungal decay due to moisture that will come in and start to rot the wood, you see lichens and moss and other things start to grow on it. Dry rot is typically associated with areas that are exposed to sun and back and forth and slowly break down the cellular structure of the wood. And then certainly something that we all have to be careful of is insect damage, termites and other aspects coming into it. Other things to look out for are checks, which are big long cracks associated with the timbers, settlement issues, and then one big area of concern that typically is the sill log, right up against the foundation. Anytime there is contact between wood and masonry, you tend to have issues. Wood is like a straw. Masonry is not so porous, especially in this region with all the dolomitic limestone. It doesn't allow for that. So, kind of moving on a little bit, you get into daubing, and this is where a lot of things happen, and it is certainly one that people look to help make them a little more efficient, so they'll have the daubing taken out and replaced. And very rarely these days do you find a cabin that is exposed to the weather that has the original daubing still within it, especially if it's being lived in. So you'll have cracked and loose daubing, which will create air and various infiltration. The use of Portland-based or synthetic mortars can always cause issues. Portland is a very non-forgiving cement, same stuff that's out in concrete. It just does not allow vapor or moisture to move through it very well, and when in contact with wood on both sides, can accelerate decay of that wood. It usually stays in place, although if it's done in too hard of a mix, it will crack over time as the wood expands and contracts, so it doesn't have any resilience to it to really let it move. And then there's a lot of synthetic mortars on the market that are more like elastomeric caulks and such, and they too have a lot of downfalls when installed in historic structures. And then generally just improper installation. If it's done, water's not coming from one side and washing over the log below it is some of the common things we find. So.
Never hear the term daubing. How did that get so I mean, even there's a synthetic product, which I'm sure you have called permit change.
Yep. It's
Where did that get sidetracked?
I'm not exactly sure where that got sidetracked. Daubing comes from timber construction, and you're a wattle and daub.
Right.
You have wood, and then you pack it with clay on both sides. I'm not exactly sure. And the chink, so I think it just became easier to call it chinking because the chinks were in there, and it kind of all blended together in our thing. So it's certainly a very common. Well, I want my chinking redone, and yes,
Right.
and I hear it all the time, and I try to just, when I do speak, kind of try to re-educate that aspect of it. So how do we go about repair techniques? How does one go about dealing with issues that are very specific to log cabins? First and foremost, if you're going to look to do work yourself, there's a lot of resources out there that can help you. Look for a reputable contractor that has had experience working on log and timber structures, and certainly there's some questions you can ask that begin to tell you whether they know their stuff or not. Because getting into log replacements, if you have a sill log that is rotten, the idea of taking a puzzle and breaking it apart, and depending on the notches, and depending on the home or whether it's an outbuilding, you can get into some real interior damage, or not damage, but destruction in order to have to do that. Knowing your way around a log cabin, there's a lot of techniques out there that can be a lot less evasive into replacing logs, and I'll get into that as we move along a little bit here. So they're definitely costly. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, and very skilled craftsmen are required to do it. So you have a big 20-foot long log. Well, you got rot in one area of it. It doesn't. There's a lot of techniques. Dutchman or splicing is a process of. It's used in all kinds of wood preservation efforts. It's basically removing a piece that is deteriorated and then introducing in a new piece of wood, and then fastening that piece together with the use of either epoxy or lots of times wooden dowels or other type of mechanical fasteners, and I'll show you some of that. But it's really just focusing on the areas that's deteriorated, because if you have a 20-foot log, it's really costly to pull that whole thing out and put it back in. A lot of that can be done simply from the exterior of a building, and it's really definitely less invasive, more preservation focused, and a whole lot cheaper when it comes down to it. So things to think about when doing all these are, one, you want to know what species of wood, so you match your species of wood. Most of the stuff around here is oak. You do find some poplar. Where I grew up, there's a lot of chestnut, which is very hard to find, or poplar or oak. So it's finding the matching materials. You do find some with pine. I tore down one in Hedgesville near my house that was a pine building. It was late 1800s, and certainly post-Civil War, and I think there weren't many trees around at the time. So, and then you get into epoxy repairs, and that is probably the least recommended one, but certainly it is out there, and people do perform epoxy repairs. And that's basically, an epoxy is a two-part system. It can be mixed with sawdust in a variety of different ways to make it aesthetically pleasing. One thing is it's very cost efficient, but if not installed properly and put in mass, it can catch fire while it's curing. It can create traps for moisture around its edges, and it's not reversible. You can't just take it out and put it back in. So people always want to know, what can I do to help preserve if it's in good shape and good condition. And certainly there are some wood preservative of treatment options out there, and these can be done through maintenance cycles, or if you're in the middle of a restoration project. The most common one used today within the industry, and I'll just back up a little bit to say that the technology swing and product swing in the preservation world has really advanced in even the last 10 years to the abilities on a chemical level for a lot of these products that were once supposedly good but actually weren't, that actually have come a long way chemically to provide very good treatments for people's homes and such. So borates are a salt-based treatment. They come in little rods or they come in a topical application, but borates are water activated, so when water comes into a log, which it will suck up moisture over time no matter what, it activates the borates, which then dissipate into the wood, and it fights the rot, it fights insect damage. So it's a treatment that can be done either prophylactically or via treatments over maintenance cycles. The Forest Product Laboratory has a variety of treatments, and you can Google them. It's more of a traditional linseed oil based wood preservative. One thing to be careful of with this is that they are very regionally specific, because there are insects in various regions of the country that love linseed oil, and it'll actually be a detriment. So it's called the Forest Product Laboratories. They're run by the Forest Service. Water repellents. We always think that, well, let's just block the water and keep it out. And this is where I said that things have come a long way, in that water repellents, if you can think about a water molecule or a piece of water as a quarter, you have a water repellency. So you want to keep the water droplet out, which is the size of a quarter. But you want to be able to let the water vapor out on this side, which is the size of a dime. So you got to have a hole the size of a nickel, so that one won't go in and one will go out. So on a chemically speaking, it's keeping the water droplets, which are larger, out, but allowing the water vapor and keeping it from being trapped behind it. And that's what, there's been a lot of issues both on masonry structures and log structures that are the result of early water repellents being used. And then certainly you do find cabins that have paints and stains on them, on the logs, and just making sure those are maintained, because those do have a protect the structure. So getting back into the daubing and chinking a bit, lime-based mortars are all that I really would recommend for use in redoing any sort of daubing. There are natural hydraulic limes are on the U.S. market today. They can be sourced through a variety of places, including locally here in Winchester at, I believe, Frederick block. And they're probably twice the cost of a Portland-based per bag material. But in the relative expense of doing redaubing a log structure, it's really insignificant in the amount of product that you really need, because you're doing small areas, you're not building a giant. So it's well worth the expense that it will create for what it's going to provide, the flexibility. Yep.
How about hydrated limes?
Yep. That's what I'm.
Hydraulics best certainly, but hydrated is okay as well.
Yep, hydrated limes work.
And if you work with hydrated limes, a lot of people want to introduce some kind of modern cements, Portland, and
Yep.
we always tell, I work at Frederick block.
Yep.
I'm Frederick block.
Okay.
And we always tell them to cut that down with as much lime as you can to get that strength
Yep.
to nothing if possible, but you need a little bit of cement in there.
You do on the hydrated limes, because they won't set without some cement within them.
Right.
Yep. So if you are going to utilize that, typically you would kind of try to stay on a 1 part cement with like 6 parts sand and about 2 or 3 parts lime. There are more restoration mixes out there. You got to be careful about getting the sand to binder ratio too high, because then I've seen applications where over time it just starts to break down because there's really not enough hydraulic binder, whether it be a cement or a natural hydraulic lime, to hold it all together, and it does break down. So cements are a science. I can't tell you how much I've learned about them over time, and they do. There is science to that whole aspect of it. So then you get into expanded wire, the chinking aspect. So somebody comes in, you knock out all the daubing, we're going to replace it. There's all these wood slats in there. Let's get those out of there and put some insulation in so we can seal this building up a little bit better. One key thing to remember is that those chinking, all those blocks in there, do something structurally. They keep those logs from bowing and settling down. So if you do make that decision, or somebody makes that decision, I'm not opposed to it. But you do need to put in blocking, much like you would do every 16 or 24 inches on a stud-like system, so that you maintain that. And then you can introduce what I recommend is expanded wire plaster lath, galvanized, to actually to hold the mortar there, the daubing there. So then there's the permachink, the synthetic daubing, that I certainly don't recommend if you run into some moisture issues and such where water can get trapped behind that. It does expand with the movement of the wood. However, I have seen where they use it on newer cabins and that stuff just shrinks up and doesn't go so well. So, any questions before I get into some photos and kind of some aspects of some of the work I've done here? I've done log cabin restoration workshops all over the country. A lot of them are all basically hands-on focus. So we'll take a cabin that has a need and actually utilize that to train in the actual trade skills needed. And that's really where HBTC focuses. This is a poplar cabin that is in Harlan County, Kentucky, at a Pine Mountain Settlement School. It is a full dovetail notch, which means it really interlocks in 2 directions, and it is one of the hardest notches to actually execute and do. Quickly over time, they modified this to being a half dovetail, which was much easier to cut and expedited time, and I think they realized that it didn't provide that much more advantage to it. So if you notice here, there's all this stone in here. Well, what had happened was the sill logs, top 2 logs, had rotted out because of the moisture from the hillside had come in, and somebody unknowingly replaced it with cinder block and faced up with stone. So we came in and actually took all that out, cribbed up or jacked up the structure. You'll see this is kind of an L bracket with a bottle jack here that essentially holds and jacks up the place. Because you got to be able to work in here, so you got to figure out a way to, and you use the chinks or the gaps between the logs as ways to help you do that. You can run steel through the center of them and jack on both sides. So another vantage point of that, we had some issues with the wall wanting to kick out, so we had to put some additional things. But you'll see all the cribbing in here. It's always done in a very safe manner with actual cribbing under, until which time you're ready to put the new log in. This is the hewing process. This gentleman here is in the process of juggling. He's making the notches that you will see on the log. This gentleman here is in the process of hewing. He's using that broad axe that I just explained to shave these pieces of wood away. So this happened prior to this. and then it will happen one more time just to make sure that it's to the right thickness. Notches will then be laid out and cut. Now, this gentleman here is using a timber framing chisel and mallet. Historically, all log building was done with an axe. They rarely had any sort of chisels. It just happens that we were doing it for that project, but they would, for instance, if you're building a log cabin and you got two logs running this way, you got the top of the notch cut, you bring the next log up and you use a set of dividers. And you would scribe the one log on top to the notch on the bottom. They would then roll it back, so there'd be two guys on each end sitting on top of the logs. They would then use their axe to chop that notch out, roll the log back over, see how it fit, roll it back, and do any adjustments. And this little device right here is called a dog, and a log dog. It would be utilized to hold one log on top of the other so that you could then keep it in a plumb and square orientation. So if you're 2 stories up, the last thing you want to do is take that log back down to the bottom. When they didn't have cranes to cut it, so it was all done kind of as it went up. In this particular case, I spoke about splices and how you would splice. This is a half lap splice here. So, for instance, in this particular case, they couldn't get logs long enough to replace these. So what we had to do was actually join 2 pieces together. So we cut half laps, and you typically want to do this with at least enough material through there, 2+ feet, and then kind of joined it together with pegs and epoxy. And there's the final product when it's all said and done. So here as well, we're also fitting our notches to make sure that when we go back to the photos before, that they'll fit in properly. So you can see it's a nice tight fit. That's part of the craftsmanship you try to match when you're doing preservation work, is you really try to focus on what was done originally so that you can match those. And there's that log now installed. You have the historic, you have the replacement, matching in character and context. See these lines right here? Those are the juggles. So if you're restoring, you always kind of build from the top down with a log cabin. So you're always putting the new log in and put the next one in below it, where you would always think you would work up. But it would only work because these all lock together, and you can't pull this one out this way because of this one, and that one won't go out because of this one. So to take a log out in the middle of a wall is not always the easiest. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. So kind of the other side of the building, there's the cinder block, and there's where we have replaced it with logs as it should be. This is Lincoln's boyhood home in Hodgensville, Kentucky. President Lincoln this is at Knob Creek Farm, and as with all Lincoln things, they don't really know if he actually lived in this cabin, but this cabin was really close to where he actually did live and was moved over here. And as you see, this also has a dovetail construction corners. But one unique aspect of this cabin is it's a gabled log end. You do not see that very often. One in hewn construction, where the logs have been hewn, and much in Appalachia or other areas. So there's some debate as to whether this was done kind of as part of the restoration, that whole Lincoln, let's restore all of Lincoln's things around the time of his birth, and the anniversary, I think in 1913 or something like that. So it's unique, whereas in round log and more of your rustic architecture, they would bring those gable ends all the way up with logs and have log purlins coming across to hold the roof. So go ahead. We basically had to really dismantle this cabin to introduce a lot of new logs into it. And then there's kind of the completed process. There are some techniques and products out there to patina logs so that they're not so new appearing. In this case, we utilized a product called Lifetime Wood Preservative, but it reacts with the tannins within the wood to gray it, put it into a more gray tone, kind of an accelerated weathering aspect.
What are the dimensions of that structure?
This structure, I think it's about 16 by 10. This is another cabin, the Creech cabin at Pine Mountain Settlement School in Kentucky. And as you can tell, the joint here was either something happened here. So we were doing a project to replace all the daubing and chinking in this structure. So if you can see here, this structure's been exposed to weather quite a bit. It's really got weathered logs. Again, another dovetail notching system, very skinny. So the first aspect is, the one thing to notice here is very wide logs, very small chinking gaps. In order to lay that out to get those close, it takes a lot of math and figuring in there. So they did a very good job. Go ahead. So in this case, they didn't have historic chinking in there. We utilized a variety of oak wedges and boards and various things that were on to continue to keep support between the logs.
Yes, I see some that have a lot of stone in them.
Yep.
The joint, was that the same thing, or was that just to fill the gap?
Same thing. It was.
Okay.
Yep. I'll have one here that has that exact same thing in it. So the application of we then put in expanded wire lath and are using a hydraulic line based mortar to go in.
On the outside, after you put that daubing in, do you have it recessed up top and have it come down and just let the whatnot to shed that water off?
Absolutely, yeah. And I got a photo that really shows that very well. You want to the rounded part of a log is called the way, and really you want to have it come up underneath the upper log and shed over top of the bottom log, so that as water rolls down, it's going to come around, drip, hit that daubing, and then shed down over the next log below it. With logs and the way they move, it's always difficult, but that's the best way to work through it. So if you see here, you can see the shadow reveal and then how it comes out over top. Lime mortars, you have to take a little bit more care with them, not to use them in full sun, give them shade. We always say that if the wall is happy and shaded, so's the worker, and it'll get done really well.
So do you bevel back the top of the joint?
Yeah, see how you see a shadow line there.
Yeah.
So it's kind of underneath the bottom edge of that log, and then it comes out onto the face and rolls onto the face of this log below it. Yeah, you can see it really well there, how it comes out here. One thing to notice, see these marks here? That was from the juggling portion of hewing. So they do that every about 12, 15 inches, and then they come and knock off the big round chunk. Okay, and then you have these marks through here. That was the neck set. That was the scoring. Which then allowed them to get the high spots and hew it down with the broad axe. And there was a previous picture before, and I'm sure there's one and some others here. You can actually see the broad axe marks throughout the log. Go ahead. This is a barn in Howard County, Maryland. This one we had to replace from here down. So in order to do so, we put big steel beams through here and basically held the upper part in place. And then came back and did all the daubing a year later. Allowed it all to dry out and acclimate. But leave it right there. If you do notice, though, this is a different notching style. It's a steeple, which is more German influence notching. Again, here's the application of the hewing process. You can see the long lines. Those were the juggling, and then the scoring with the broad axe in there. These are called yokes. They use to hold the log up at about knee or mid-thigh height. And you would typically work the log from one end to the other, keeping it in a plumb orientation. Now, there's some debate about whether hewing happens sideways or standing up and down, and I think it depends on where you were and how you learned that one. So, you have a question?
Recognizing there's probably no standard length, but just out of curiosity, how long it's known, does it take to get a felled tree to a finished log like that?
Yeah. Well, typically a cabin was anywhere 16 to 24 in length of wall length. The largest cabin I've seen in this area, as far as size, was 32 feet of a single log, and that was at Antietam Battlefield. There may be others out there, but to fell the tree, to get the tree limbed and bring it in, and then hew it, they could hew one log a day, probably. So you're looking at, if it was just one, that's one person, and teams of mules and various things, so it's quite a labor-intensive process all the way around. So this is a project at Hampton Mansion outside of Baltimore.
Would they like drop a log and let them dry out for a period of time?
No, you want to hew them green.
Yeah.
Green wood hews a lot easier than dried wood, so you would typically hew it, and then if you wanted, you could let it dry out, but you got to watch out, it'll twist and everything else. So, the log you just saw was being used for this project here. It was a slave cabin at Hampton Plantation Mansion. If you notice here, this all has stone chinking in it, so it was not uncommon to then use those pieces to burn if you were in more an area, and utilize other resources to fill your gaps. So you see it different places. This adds a good bit of weight to the building, but the fact that it's all carrying itself all the way up here. I'd like to point out this right here. There's another one right here. This is a replacement log from, I want to say, the 70s. In order to, say, get this log out and a new one back in, they had to actually cut the top part of this notch away, like this here, and put the log in on top of this one, and then add that piece back in, and they would either epoxy it or fasten it in some manner. So, in order to take a full log out, you do, without jacking the entire building up above it, which can be done, but it certainly, if you have any sort of interior space within that, it's going to really mess with it. So techniques such as that, and that's where the use of epoxies and modern glues and even modern screws and fasteners really are very good, because you can countersink a stainless steel screws through this, cover it over, and you know you have a very well fastened. This corner's not going to blow out on you. See, you notice there's isolated areas of rot here. There's isolated areas of rot around this corner. There's some more splicing being done. You have part of a historic log here being added to a replacement or a newly hewn log. some would say, well, why don't you just replace the whole thing? This is where we're guided, certainly as a homeowner and various others, you have every right to get into that. We are, as the National Park Service, mandated by the Secretary of Interior standards, and it requires us to preserve as much of the historic fabric as possible. And this is a technique by which we do that, and it's similar to the same technique I showed you where we just used it to extend a log. And now you see where the new logs have been introduced. You see one here that had a splice on this end and a splice on this end. A very small splicing area here, top and bottom. Due to the historic nature of this, the fact that a lot of stuff had been replaced in the 70s, we took a lot of extra care to make sure we tried to retain as much of that fabric, because if it was a log from the 70s, we were a lot more liberal of just fully replacing it, and that's probably what occurred here. But anything that was of original, we tried to very much maintain as much of it as possible. You'll see the rocks getting placed back in there.
You have signs of splicing in the 18th century?
Oh yeah, yeah. I
Same
mean,
techniques?
same techniques. They would do a lot of scarf. If they were, for instance, it's more of a, that's probably CCC era, but I've seen a lot of scarf joints where you see them in timber frame barns at the top to make larger log structures out of. Not what you'll see when you get into a lot of cabins is that people altered them over time, added additions to the house, cut fenestrations, then took them away and put logs back in, and didn't always do it well, but sometimes they did. So you can see there we just replaced a corner. It was, you see we kind of from there, the daubing slopes out. There's another photo where the just had, in order to get it back in, had to put that little steeple in there. Here's, if you notice, this one's got a about an 8-inch. It's an 8-inch log wall thickness. Typical 6 inches. This structure came from the oldest settlement west of the Allegheny Front, in Frankfort, West Virginia. It was dated back to about 1790, as early as we could get it back, but it served as a fort, it served as a jail, it served as a lot of things, and when you look at this cabin, you can really tell the craftsmanship between something that was probably used more as a municipal or government-funded type of building versus somebody who was just trying to use it as a shelter residence. Portland cement there, you see cracking associated with Portland cement, some settlement and movement. Yes?
How often do you ever see boxing in the corners to protect the joints?
I've not seen that very much. Typically in eastern hewn log construction, the crown ends, or these ends, are protected within the roof line of a structure. Once the kind of the modern outdoor log rustic architecture came in, and even you go out west, even on hewn, they run these out 2-3 feet sometimes, and you have these long crowns that sit out beyond the roof line and then are really exposed to the weather. So typically I haven't seen just the corners boxed in at all.
These guys had a 2-man saw in place usually too, I guess, right?
Oh, 2-man crosscut saw? Yeah, these ends would have been cut off with the 2-man crosscut saw. They would have cut, see how that shoulder comes down? That was an axe cut shoulder. Many times with dovetails, because you had a hard shoulder here on the dovetail, they would cut that with a, not necessarily a 2-man, but just a single-handed handsaw. The tools, they were rather simple, but they did have saws and did utilize them because they had to do the jams and some other. It minimized the need for sawn lumber by utilizing log construction. So You only needed sawn lumber for your sheathing of your roof and for around your windows and doors. So it really allowed you to keep the raw materials and such right there. So, any other questions? Yeah.
What were the round, some of the logs have round holes? Was that part of the instruments used to hold them?
Yeah, those were wooden pegs. Like mortise and tenon would have a peg to hold them together. So those were just pegs utilized instead of utilizing nails or screws to splice two pieces of wood together.
Okay, so if you see a round hole in a log,
Yeah.
there could have been a peg in
They
there.
would put a peg. Lots of times they utilized, they put holes in them to hang things on. They would put a peg in there to hang things off of, and very utilitarian purposes.
This is staying on task here a little bit, but on the pole rafters, lots of times you hear all different stories about why they numbered them. Do you know what how they put Roman numbers?
Yep.
What's the story on that?
Well, they would join them on the ground,
That's-
and then they would notch them so that when they brought them up, they'd know what went together.
That's what I was-
So it's just
on that.
a way to show that these two go together.
Right.
You'll see them on timber frame barns at the mortise joint, and then on the tenon, so that when they cut everything on the ground, they know what went together.
Your place here in Frederick, that's a training center for you all? basically,
Yeah,
right?
we train National Park Service employees. We also run a traditional trades youth program where we bring youth from the ages of about 18 to 24 in through our program for internships of sorts, and they then go out and travel around and kind of learn by doing as much as anything. So, and then we also train with other government agencies and all the way down to local and nonprofit. So we are a non-appropriated part of the National Park Service. So all of our funding comes and is brought in through doing preservation projects as a service. So.
On that note, the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club has a significant number of log cabins
Yep.
in this vicinity that are old, and some of them have been moved and rebuilt and so forth. Have you done any workshops with the PATC in terms of their log structures?
I think, I'm not sure specifically with that organization, but we have done some work, certainly with Shenandoah National Park on some of their structures along the Appalachian Trail and others. So it's a good organization. I do know about it, and they do have a lot of structures along the trail that are pretty unique.
Something like 6,000 volunteers now.
Yeah, and to really the skills aren't hard. I've taken groups of 10 to 15 people and executed this type of work with people that really don't have log skills, and it's the reality of it. It's very simple construction from a standpoint, and it's just knowing the tools and how to operate them. So certainly, that's my email address. You can find us at nps.gov under the Historic Preservation Training Center. We're part of the learning and development community of the National Park Service. One of the big outreach programs of the National Park Service is to promote community awareness and such of preservation matters, and not to keep it to ourselves. So we've launched what's called the Common Learning Portal, and it's going through its kind of beta testing right now, but hopefully by January, if not maybe a little later, it will be a learning portal that will be open to the public. There'll be a public side and a government side, but it's going to be there to allow people to access information that the National Park Service has on a variety of subjects, but a lot of it revolving around the care of cultural resources and historic structures. So it's about that, and helping to connect and keep access to experts available to people. So
How is that going to differ from preservation briefs?
The preservation briefs will be on as part of that, but recognizing that the preservation briefs haven't necessarily kept up with the times, and I'll be the first to admit a lot of those preservation briefs are out of date, and a lot has transpired in the way of technology and techniques since they've done, and certainly I wouldn't be fair to you all to say that they're the Bible and to go by them. So it'll be a collection of those as well as a lot of other information, because today we learn in a lot of different ways than we used to. We used to come to sit in the classroom and got all your information, and that's how you learned. But we're learning in a variety of ways through YouTube and Facebook and various ways, and part of our job is to get to be on that same page with people and bring the information in ways that means it, but is also somewhat vetted to those standards that the Park Service has for preservation.
So when do you expect this to?
Depending on how things go technology-wise, it's estimated sometime in mid-January.
Oh,
So it could go longer, but
that could be a great resource.
oh, it will be a great resource and a way for people to learn. So
Well, thank you, Melissa. That was really a great program. I'm glad